At 4 in the morning on the 24th of February 2022, residents of Mariupol, a coastal city on the Sea of Azov, awoke to the sound of powerful explosions. Russia had launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and this industrial port city became one of the first targets of the aggressor. Mariupol held immense strategic importance. It was the largest city under Ukrainian control in the Donetsk region, a vital trading port, and a symbol of Ukraine's presence on the Azov coast. Since 2014, Mariupol had also been a stronghold that halted the advance of pro-Russian forces. It was no surprise, then, that on the very first day of the invasion, Russian artillery opened massive fire on the city, injuring at least 26 civilians. The next day, Russian troops advanced from occupied Donetsk. Ukrainian defenders engaged them near villages east of the city and halted an enemy column, destroying dozens of tanks. At that time, Mariupol's residents still believed the city could be defended within days, but the pressure only intensified. By March 2, the aggressor had fully encircled Mariupol, cutting off all land routes. Thus began one of the most brutal sieges of the 21st century, 87 days of heroic defense. Trapped in the blockade, about 150,000 civilians and the Ukrainian garrison of Mariupol faced a humanitarian catastrophe. The city's infrastructure quickly collapsed. Power lines were severed, water and gas supplies stopped, and communication was lost. Continuous shelling by Russian artillery and aircraft never ceased. On March 2, residential neighborhoods were bombarded for 15 consecutive hours. According to the city council, hundreds of people died in a single evening. Apartment buildings burned across the city, while the air was filled with the whistle of Grad rockets and the thunder of explosions. Bombs were falling every 10 minutes. Ukrainian fighters later recalled of those days of unending fire. People hid in basements without food or water. Many drank heating fluid or melted snow to quench their thirst. Homes were destroyed or damaged by 95%, and the streets were buried under ruins. The International Committee of the Red Cross described the situation in Mariupol as apocalyptic, as Ukrainian authorities estimated that about 25,000 civilians were killed within the first few weeks. Bodies lay in the open, buried hastily in mass graves in courtyards. Volodymyr, a city resident, later told journalists, "Our city was turned into hell on earth. Every day, we thought we would die." Such was the price of Mariupol's refusal to surrender in the first days of the war. The defenders of Mariupol, fighters of the Azov Regiment, the 36th Separate Marine Brigade, units of the Armed Forces and National Guard of Ukraine, police officers, and volunteers stood to defend the city from the first hours. They were vastly outnumbered. Russia brought in regular army units, separatist forces of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, the occupied part of Donetsk region, Chechen detachments, and even naval infantry, attempting to land from the sea. Yet the Ukrainian soldiers held their ground, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy in battles, on the approaches, and in the suburbs. Azov fighter Artem Dubina recalled that even before the war, the garrison understood its mission to hold Mariupol at any cost. We knew it would be a siege, that enormous forces would be thrown against us. But we also knew, the longer we held Mariupol, the more enemy troops we would pin down, and that would give other cities like Zaporizhia time to prepare their defenses, Dubina explained, and that is exactly what happened. While Mariupol's garrison drew dozens of enemy battalions onto itself, Ukraine managed to organize the defense of Kyiv, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, and other fronts. The defenders of Mariupol understood their role and fought on, even as their situation grew ever more desperate. In early March, Russian forces repeatedly promised to open a green corridor for the evacuation of civilians, but every time they violated the agreements and disrupted evacuations with renewed shelling. On March 5, columns of civilians gathered to leave. The city were forced to disperse under new artillery strikes. In those days, the people of Mariupol lived in basements under constant bombardment. Children's voices whispered in the dark they asked for bread and water, but adults often had nothing to give, as humanitarian warehouses had burned down and shops were bombed and looted. Hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded. Surgeries had to be performed in basements by flashlight, without enough anesthesia or medicine. On March 9, the world was shaken by footage of the bombed-out Mariupol maternity hospital. Among the shattered walls, pregnant women covered in dust and blood struggled to save their newborns. One of them, the woman seen in the now iconic photo, being carried on a stretcher, tragically died, along with her unborn child, a horrifying price for this war crime. Russian aviation had deliberately destroyed the hospital, even though the word "children" was clearly painted in large letters around the building for pilots to see. A week later, on March 16, the Mariupol Drama Theatre was bombed, a place where hundreds of civilians, mostly women and children, were sheltering. This large theatre had become the main refuge for residents who had lost their homes. Next to it, too, the word "children" was written in massive letters on the ground, visible from the sky. But that did not stop the enemy. The airstrike turned the theatre into a mass grave. According to the city council, about 300 to 600 people were killed. Only by miracle did some of those deep in the basement survive and crawl out. The screams of the wounded and the cries of children echoed everywhere. "It was the greatest tragedy I have ever witnessed," recalled a volunteer who survived the bombing. Every day, Mariupol lost more of its people to bombs, to shelling, to lack of medical aid, to thirst, and to the cold. Yet Ukrainian defenders held their ground among the ruins, fighting on two fronts at once against the external enemy and against the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in the city. By the end of March, Russian troops had captured the suburbs and were gradually advancing deeper into Mariupol. Street battles broke out. Every block, every street became a front line. The defenders, with limited manpower and ammunition, maneuvered and fell back toward the city center, where two massive metallurgical plants, Azovstal and the Illich Iron and Steel Works, were located. These industrial giants, with their vast workshops and sprawling underground bunkers, became natural fortresses for Ukrainian fighters. Azovstal alone occupies 1/5 of Mariupol. The plant's territory spans about 11.5 square kilometers, roughly 26 times larger than the Vatican and 5 times the size of Monaco. On the evening of March 13, under heavy artillery fire, the city's TV tower collapsed. Mariupol was plunged into information isolation. Meanwhile, Russian propaganda spread false claims, saying that Ukrainian defenders were allegedly preventing civilians from leaving, or that Mariupol's residents were to blame for their own suffering. But the truth was seen by the world, thanks to the efforts of Ukrainian journalists and military press units. For example, fighters of the Azov Regiment filmed and documented the enemy's crimes even under fire. Those images, the ruins of the maternity hospital, the destroyed theater, weeping women and children hiding in basements spread across the globe, provoking shock and condemnation. Mariupol became a symbol of both civilian tragedy and the heroism of its defenders. By early April, the situation of the Ukrainian garrison had grown even more dire. Ammunition, fuel, and food were nearly exhausted. Supplying the city by air or sea was extraordinarily dangerous. Yet the Ukrainian command found a way to support the besieged. Intelligence operatives of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine organized a series of secret helicopter missions to Mariupol. At night, flying at extremely low altitude under cover of darkness, Ukrainian pilots broke through enemy air defenses to deliver critical supplies. There were 7 such missions in total. They brought crates of weapons, including stingers and javelins, ammunition, medicine, and food. One mission even delivered reinforcements. 72 fighters of the Azov Regiment parachuted directly into Azovstal, bolstering the plant's defense. On the return flights, helicopters evacuated the most severely wounded, those in need of urgent surgery. These flights became legendary for their bravery. Pilots flew, knowing they might not reach their destination or come back. Sadly, not all of them did. During the 5th mission, one Mi-8 helicopter was hit by Russian fire and crashed while leaving Mariupol. The 7th mission ended in tragedy. When one helicopter was struck by a missile in an enemy ambush, another crew rushed to its rescue, only to be shot down as well. The 2 iron birds fell side by side on occupied territory, like in a movie, lying now next to each other. Soldiers later recalled, in total, The Ukrainian army lost at least 3 helicopters in these high-risk operations, but most missions completed their objectives. If we'd had more chances, we would have flown again, the pilots later admitted. Yet even these daring supply flights could not change the overall course of events. The noose around Mariupol continued to tighten. On April 4, Russian forces captured the building of the Mariupol City Council and raised the flag of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic above it. The fighting shifted toward the seaport and the industrial zones. The city's defenders were divided into 2 groups. Part of them retreated to the Ilyich, iron, and steel works in the north, while the others held their positions at Azovstal on the coast. The defense continued in isolated pockets, despite the lack of communication between units. On April 7, the enemy seized the Mariupol port to the west of Azovstal, cutting the defenders off from the sea. By mid-April, the situation for the 36th Marine Brigade, which held out at the Ilyich plant, became critical. After a month and a half without reinforcements and with minimal ammunition, the Marines faced a stark choice: death or an attempt to break through. The brigade's commander, Major Serhiy Volinsky, call sign Volina, decided to attempt a breakthrough to join their comrades from the Azov Regiment at Azovstal. During the night of April 12, a small column of Marines broke through enemy lines, reached the Azovstal plant, and successfully linked up with the Azov fighters. This daring raid came at a high cost. Some soldiers died covering the breakout, some were captured, and others, including another battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Baranyuk, went missing. However, several hundred Marines managed to merge with the Azovstal garrison. For the first time since the beginning of the siege, all fragmented defending forces united now, within the vast territory of the steelworks, fought one combined Mariupol garrison. This newfound unity boosted the defenders' morale. They continued to defend every meter of their homeland, even as the enemy threw ever more forces against them. On April 21, the 57th day of the siege, the Kremlin announced that Mariupol had been taken under control. In reality, Ukrainian soldiers still held out in the underground catacombs of Azovstal and had no intention of surrendering. Russian President Putin then ordered his troops not to storm the plant but to blockade it completely, so that not even a fly could get through. This command revealed that the Russians were afraid to storm the well-fortified underground complex after suffering heavy losses in previous assaults. Instead, they chose to starve and bomb the defenders into submission. The Azovstal plant turned into a hellish trap. Above ground, total devastation, mountains of concrete and steel, below kilometers of tunnels and bunkers where hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians had taken refuge. These shelters, designed during the Soviet era for potential nuclear war, could withstand enormous blasts, but the enemy possessed powerful aerial bombs. Day and night, Russian aircraft Tu-22 bombers and Su-25 attack jets dropped 10-ton high-explosive bombs, concrete-piercing munitions, and by late April, even guided thermobaric vacuum bombs. The explosions shook the ground so violently that the floors beneath the defenders trembled, lights flickered, and dust rained down from ventilation shafts. Shockwaves reached even the deepest bunkers, deafening and concussing those inside. In early May, one of the bombs penetrated a shelter and collapsed an improvised hospital within the underground complex. Around 300 people were inside, wounded soldiers and civilians, including children. Many died beneath the rubble, others were injured again. But the Ukrainians had little choice. If they didn't stay underground, they would die above from shrapnel or bullets. One defender, Marine Vyacheslav, later recalled, "When you go up to the surface, you see only total destruction, the plant reduced to ruins, smoke everywhere. You can't tell if it's day or night because the sun is hidden behind black clouds of fire." The Russians burned everything that could burn, trying to smoke out the Ukrainian fighters, but they held their ground, refusing to yield. In the catacombs of Azovstal, a large number of wounded had gathered, at least several hundred. The doctors did everything they could, but medical supplies were running out. Surgeons operated right on the concrete floor of the bunker, often without anesthesia or even proper sterile instruments. Amputations were done in the simplest ways, and wounds were cauterized to stop the bleeding. "We didn't even have the ability to give blood transfusions to those who had lost too much," recalled Artem Dubaina, who was seriously wounded during the fighting. When a sniper's bullet pierced his neck, his comrades carried him out of the combat zone under the cover of mortar smoke screens. Artem lay unconscious in a coma for 3 days in the underground hospital. I lost a lot of blood, but they couldn't give me a transfusion or even an intravenous. My body had to fight on its own, he said. His story was not unique. Dozens of fighters with severe injuries, infections, and gangrene waited desperately for help. Antibiotics were almost gone. Bandages and dressings were reused. The defenders grew weaker from hunger by the end of the siege. Each soldier received no more than one meager meal per day, a handful of porridge or a few dry crackers. They drank water every other day, technical water, barely filtered. Despite this, the defenders still took turns at their positions, repelling assaults and holding on to hope. That hope, a hope for a miracle, flickered until the very end. As long as journalists and military media remained active, the defenders sent messages to the outside world, pleading for help to save the people of Mariupol. On April 20, Marine Commander Serhiy Volinsky released a video address to world leaders, saying the defenders' situation was at the brink. We may be living our last days, if not ours. The enemy outnumbers us 10 to 1. He begged for an extraction procedure to evacuate the garrison to a safe third country, as no other option remained. After that silence, Russia refused all proposals. The Kremlin wanted to destroy or capture the Ukrainian fighters, especially those from the Azov Regiment, toward whom Russia harbored particular hatred. Meanwhile, civilians also hid in the plant's catacombs, families of factory workers and residents from nearby neighborhoods who had found refuge there. Among them were children, even infants, women, and the elderly. Throughout March and April, they lived underground alongside the soldiers, sharing their last drops of water and bits of food. When the situation became critically dire in April, the Ukrainian government, through the UN and the Red Cross, demanded the evacuation of these civilians. Finally, in early May, a small relief came. Under UN guarantees, the Russians allowed several bus convoys into Azovstal. Across 3 evacuation stages, April 29, 30, May 1-3, and May 6-7, more than 300 civilians, all women, children, and elderly people were evacuated from the plant's underground shelters. The process took place under international supervision and cameras, as Russia sought to showcase its supposed humanitarian behavior. But each green corridor came at a terrible price. Captain Sviatoslav Palomar, Kalina, deputy commander of the Azov Regiment, reported on May 7 that while another civilian convoy was being evacuated, the enemy broke the ceasefire and opened fire on the Ukrainian soldiers escorting the evacuation. 3 Ukrainian fighters were killed and 6 were wounded that day while protecting civilians. The Mariupol garrison fulfilled its duty to the end, saving everyone it could. The Mariupol garrison did everything possible to rescue the civilian population, emphasized Serhiy Volinsky in his message. After the civilians were evacuated, only the soldiers remained at Azovstal. The defense had reached its breaking point. The Ukrainian leadership understood at the highest level that militarily unblocking Mariupol was impossible. The front was too far away, and reserves were lacking. To save the soldiers' lives, other solutions had to be found. The defenders' commanders continued to hope for a miracle. On May 8, Serhiy Volinsky published an emotional open letter on social media, calling the situation at Azovstal a hellish reality show. It feels as though I'm part of some infernal reality show where we, the soldiers, are fighting for our lives, using every chance to survive, while the whole world just watches an interesting story unfold. But this is not a movie, and we are not fictional characters. This is real life. Pain, suffering, hunger, torment, tears, fear, death, all of it is real, Volinsky wrote. He openly expressed deep disappointment with the cynicism and inaction of the world's powerful. There were supposed to be international laws protecting soldiers and civilians, but in practice, they meant nothing. What am I hoping for? For a miracle? For higher powers to find a solution for our rescue, and for this hellish reality show to end, he added, urging everyone to do whatever possible to save the soldiers, just as the civilians had been saved. This desperate cry from the heart was, in essence, the defenders' final message to the world. What followed was the final act of the Mariupol saga. On May 10, Ukraine's General Staff officially reported that more than 1,000 Ukrainian servicemen were trapped in the catacombs of Azovstal, several hundred of them seriously wounded. The shelling continued, though less intensely. The Russians had shifted their main forces to other fronts, leaving only minimal troops to blockade the plant. Explosions still echoed across the ruins, smoke filled the air, but the Ukrainian fighters held their positions. On May 11, the wives and mothers of the Azov fighters held a press conference in Kyiv, pleading with the international community to help rescue their loved ones. Then came May 16, the day everyone feared, yet knew was inevitable. The Defenders Command received an order from above to preserve the lives of the personnel. Early that morning, a white flag was raised over Azovstal. A small Ukrainian delegation emerged for negotiations on a ceasefire. By evening, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine officially announced that the Mariupol garrison had completed its combat mission and that an operation had begun to save the personnel through evacuation. That day, the first groups of defenders, mostly wounded, and medics began to emerge from the underground bunkers of the steelworks. A total of 264 Ukrainian soldiers, including 53 seriously wounded, surrendered and were transported by bus to the occupied territory for medical assistance. Before this, the commander of the Azov Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Denis Prokopenko, Redis, released a message to the Ukrainian people. To preserve lives, the entire Mariupol garrison is carrying out the approved decision of the higher military command and hopes for the support of the Ukrainian nation, he said in his video address. Those words meant one thing: the unbroken warriors of Mariupol were forced to lay down their arms to survive. None of them wanted to surrender from the first days of the siege. The fighters had said that captivity was equivalent to death, but the moment had come when continuing resistance meant senseless suicide. They carried out their command's order, the final order of this battle. Over the next 2 days, May 17, 18, and 19, more and more columns of defenders emerged from Azovstal. Hundreds of exhausted, bearded Ukrainian soldiers, burned by sun and war, laid down their personal weapons under the watchful eyes of Russian troops. They were searched and loaded onto buses. Some carried their wounded comrades on their shoulders, men barely able to walk from injuries and disease. Russian propaganda filmed these scenes eagerly, calling it a mass surrender, though in reality it was an organized evacuation agreed upon at the highest level. For Ukraine, saving the lives of its soldiers was the priority, even if it meant temporary captivity. Russia, on the other hand, hastened to declare that 2,439 nationalists had been captured and that Mariupol had been completely denazified. On May 20, the last defenders left the plant, among them commanders Denis Prokopenko, Serhiy Volinsky, and Sviatoslav Palomar. The Russians transported them separately to a detention center in occupied Donetsk. At 2 p.m. that day, Russia's Ministry of Defense triumphantly announced the complete liberation of the Azovstal plant. In truth, those words meant that nearly 3 months of inhuman defense had come to an end, not according to the Kremlin's plan. Mariupol was supposed to fall in 3 days, but it held for 87, not through a parade of victory, but through a grueling blockade and an agreement with the very defenders Russia had failed to defeat in battle. Thus ended the Mariupol epic of the spring of 2022, one of the most tragic and heroic chapters of the modern war. The enemy received a city of ruins, devastated and lifeless, paying for it with thousands of soldiers and destroyed equipment. Ukraine temporarily lost Mariupol, but gained something far more important: time to prepare new defensive lines. As a result of Mariupol's defenders, Ukraine gained critically important time to gather reserves, regroup its forces, and receive help from partners. They fulfilled all assigned tasks, said Deputy Minister of Defense Hanna Maliar, explaining the importance of their sacrifice. The defense of Mariupol has already entered history as a symbol of the unbreakable Ukrainian spirit. The world saw how a handful of soldiers, without food, without reinforcements, completely encircled, fought for 87 days against an overwhelming enemy force. And they fought successfully for as long as it was humanly possible. The way Ukrainian soldiers defended the plant, despite wounds, exhaustion, and the lack of ammunition or even food, and has already gone down in history as one of the most heroic military operations ever, observers wrote. The participants themselves say humbly that they were simply doing their duty, standing by each other to the very end. Ahead of the Mariupol heroes lay captivity, months and years in the prisons of the occupier. The Russian authorities immediately began threatening a show trial against the Azov fighters, branding them as Nazis. In the camps of captivity, they faced abuse, torture, and even death. On July 29, 2022, more than 50 captured defenders of Azovstal were killed in an explosion at the Olenivka prison colony. Yet the light of hope did not go out. Over the following months, some of Mariupol's defenders were brought home through prisoner exchange agreements. In September 2022, the legendary commanders Denis Prokopenko, Kalina Palomar, and Valina Volinsky, the very leaders of the defense, were released from Russian captivity. By that time, a total of 485 Azov Regiment fighters had been freed, though more than 1,000 still remained imprisoned, waiting for their turn to return. Ukraine continues to fight for the release of every one of its heroes. Meanwhile, the destroyed Mariupol remains under occupation, a ghost city, where there is no longer a Ukrainian word or a free life. But the feat of Mariupol's defenders lives on in the memory of the nation.